So you have Romans. I would like to remember them in this. There is singles and there is doubles. Like there is some First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, First Thessalonians, Second Thessalonians, First Timothy, Second Timothy. There is doubles and there is singles. So how many doubles we have? It's just kind of to make you remember them. You have, there is the 2 Corinthians, First and Second Corinthians, and you have singles until you come to the Thessalonians. There's First and Second Thessalonians, and there's First and Second Timothy. How many they are? 3 times 2 is 6 out of the 13. We said Hebrews we're going to leave. Hebrews is the last one in St. Paul list. So 6 out of the 13 you have 7 left. All what you need to remember is the 7. But actually the 2s are easy. It's 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians. 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy. Just remember those 6. There are only 3 names, but first and second. Remember, the letter to the Romans is the first one, and they call it the Gospel of St. Paul. Why? It is the theology of St. Paul in one letter. When you listen to the stories of saints from the 1st and 2nd century, even to the 3rd century, one of the most famous I know is Saint Helena, the mother of King Constantine. Her conversion was by the letter to the Romans to become a Christian. She didn't have any of the Gospels. So that is how she got hold of Christ's Gospel, by the letter to the Romans. So the letter to the Romans is very significant. I would say the summation of all St. Paul's theology. Some of it is really difficult. And it has the most difficult passages, which I mean Romans 9, 10, and 11. How many chapters? 16. Okay? The 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, just remember, Corinth is a bad city, known for a very famous activity. They had the temple of Aphrodite, and the temple was served by sexual immorality. So you would expect this letter to address problems related to sexual immorality. Okay, these 2 letters, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So you go from the Gospel of St. Paul, which is Romans, 16th chapter, to the letter to the Corinthians, 16 and 13. The 4th one, the 3rd name, Galatians, is 6. So Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 6:4. Galatians is about this exact problem. You're going to see it in all the letters. Galatians specifically, it's the only letter that in one of the translations he called stupid. It's foolish. It's the only letter that he calls them names. You usually don't, St. Paul doesn't say that, do that. Galatians is the church where people started to revert back to Judaism. That's why he goes very aggressively. He gets very mad. In that letter, you would hear him say things, who threw a spell on you, did magic on you to convert you back to Judaism? Do you want to abandon Christ and go back to the old law? That is Galatians. So again, if I want you to remember just simple things, Romans is the Gospel of St. Paul. Corinthians is sexual immorality. Galatians is going back to Judaism. Okay? Ephesians is a symphony about the church. That's where he actually tells you what the church is. It's really a poetry. I love Ephesians. Ephesians and Philippians are my favorites. Ephesians is where he explains the body of Christ. There's images. There's 3 images in Ephesians about the church. He calls the church the body of Christ. He calls the church the building. And he calls the church the spouse. That's why in Ephesians you have to talk about the wife and the husband. You have to talk about the children. You have to talk about being members of the same building, of the same household. Philippians is poetry about joy and unity. This is the most, that's why we'll start with it. This the lightest, the most joyful, the exciting letter, and the shortest. And the letters to the churches. Then there's Thessalonians and Colossians. Now, when we go past Philippians, you get Colossians. Colossians is theology about who Christ is. He is the firstborn of all creation. He is the image of the invisible Father. Is the big terminology about Christ in the first chapter. So this is where Colossians is. And then in the Nelson map and chart where I get some of the stuff out, is he's talking about the cosmic Christ. That Christ is the high priest of all creation. Thessalonians, first and second. So let's go back. First one is Roman, the Gospel of St. Paul. Then the 2 Corinthians. Then the foolish Galatians. Then let's keep it with titles like the Gospel of the Romans, the sexual immorality of the Corinthians, which is 2, and then the foolishness of Galatians, and then the poetry of the church of Ephesians, and then the poetry of joy of Philippians, and then the theology of Christ of Colossians. And then you go into another set of 2s. So you have one set of 2s, 1, 2, 3, 4, another set of 2s. 1 couple, 4 couple. You following? Then Thessalonians is about the end of days. It is in Thessalonians that he talks about the coming of the Antichrist. It is in Thessalonians that people have a heresy about that the day of the Lord is almost like the Jehovah's Witness heresy, where they talk about the multiple end of times and Christ had come and had come and had come and nothing is happening. Thessalonians is about the end of times. If you want to look into places, talks about the end of times, Thessalonians, a little bit of 1 Corinthians 15 has it too, just to keep in mind, where we read it in the night of the Holy Resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15, remember that. Then we have the personal, we end up with personal letters, not to churches. So Thessalonians will end your church letters. You have the beginning with the third set of couples, which is 1st and 2nd Timothy, and then Titus, and then Philemon. Okay? These are all pastoral. It is letters to how to lead the church. Titus was a bishop. Timothy was a bishop. Philemon was a bishop, but also he had a problem with his slave. And he was writing this letter. It's a very personal letter. Out of all of them, Philemon is a very specific thing. Accept Onesimus back. Onesimus, it's a beautiful story. Onesimus was a slave of Philemon who had stole his money and ran and then was converted by St. Paul. When St. Paul met him, he heard the story, felt bad for Onesimus, said, go back to your master, reconcile yourself to him. I'm going to write him a letter. He writes him a letter and says, if he took any money from you, I'll give it back to you. Philemon is 1 chapter, and that's it. That's the story. So the last 4 is the personal letters. 2 Timothy, 1 Titus, and 1 Philemon. Okay? Can we now recite the names? And this is this session. We're done. I think if you get the names of the letters this day, I'm happy. I've done my job. So the first one is the Gospel of the second couple. The second one is the couple is 1st and 2nd Corinthians. It is about, mainly it's the job of fixing their morality. It's where you find what happens if a man makes a big sin, to marry or not to marry. All that stuff is in the Corinthians. And then after Corinthians you have the 4 letters. Galatians, the foolish, right? Then the Ephesians with the poetry about the church. It has the 3 images, which are the body, the building, and the spouse. And then after that, Philippians, which is the joyful letter. And then after that, Colossians, which is the theology about Christ. So there is contrast between Colossians and Ephesians. Ephesians is about the church. Colossians is about Christ. And then 2 Thessalonians. And the main subject there is the end of times. And then you have 1st, 2nd Timothy, Titus, First and Second Timothy and Titus is about, they are all personal, but the first three is about leadership in the church. They are bishops. Titus, Timothy are bishops. Philemon may be also a leader, but Philemon specifically is about his slave. He always start with a greeting. Some of the priests actually are people who are pious people in the church. They would greet you in the email by peace and grace. But you wonder, where is that coming from? It's from St. Paul. Why St. Paul choose peace and grace? Peace in the Hebrew language is shalom. Shabbat shalom. Peace of the Sabbath means we're resting. The peace of the resting. But the Greeks used to greet each other with something like grace. So when he sends his letter to a church that's mixed, what will he need to do? Greet them with the two languages, with shalom for the Hebrews and with grace for the Greeks. So that's the normal greeting. It's all and almost in all the letters. St. Paul's burden for addresses is revealed in his thanksgiving, in thanksgiving for the spiritual progress of his readers, like in Thessalonians, intercession sometimes in Philippians. He also, his concern, he's very concerned about some of the churches. You can feel that in his writing. In the writing of the Galatians, you can feel the heat. When I read Galatians, I feel him like he's jumping up and down when he's writing. He writes with a very strong language. And sometimes in the letter to Corinthians 2, when he writes about this man who committed sexual immorality with his mother, stepmother, he was like furious. He said, as he says, as my spirit with you and the Lord is our witness, this man should be excommunicated. Was very angry. If you read carefully the letters of St. Paul, you would understand. This is the most important thing. If you read it carefully, you understand what kind of a spirit you should be. A Christian sometimes think that I should be always mellow and nice and sweet. Yes, and Jesus was. But sometimes he was a roaring lion. He can't be always sweet. When something is happening wrong, you cannot just stand by and say, we have to be kind, we have to be nice, and we have to be gentle. No, not really. Okay? And so St. Paul was the same. St. Paul's letters cover both doctrinal and practical issues. Most of the time, you read the letters of St. Paul, he starts the letters with theology, deep explanations of God's work. But the last part of it is advices and practice. There's exception. You understand, like the letter is divided into two parts. Theoretical, that's where you get theology from, and also practical. Philippians is not the same. Philippians, actually, we're going to start with next time, is mix. He gets a little bit of theology, and he tells you what to do. A little bit of theology, and a little bit, one of the most famous, let the mind of Christ be in all of you. Because he was in the form of God, and he emptied himself, you too should be humble. Immediately. He doesn't really get too much distance between theoretical or theology and practical. Let's go into this timeline because it's important too. And if you remember the letters now, we go into the second memorizable list. This is 48 AD, and this is 68 AD and 95. The first missionary journey, the second missionary journey, so the first is between, it's almost 50 AD. The first missionary journey is 50. You see it here. The second missionary journey is between 50 and 53. The third is between 53 and 57. Then the first Roman imprisonment is 60 to 63. They think there is a fourth missionary journey in between the two imprisonments. Then he's imprisoned again before he is executed between 67 and 68. He was martyred in that year with St. Peter in the same year. And who was the Caesar, the emperor? Anybody knows? Nero. Nero is the one who took care of both of them. Okay? So when you try to take the letters, how many we said letters? 13 letters. And put them against the timeline, this is how it comes out. You have 1, 2, that's 3, 7, and then you have 11, and you have Galatians, right? The first one. Yeah. That's a question mark because they don't. Some people say it's here, some people say it's here. And wherever you have a question mark, it is questionable. It is not really fixed date. People debate it. Okay? So the first one to be written is Galatians, maybe. Then Thessalonians, then Corinthians, and Romans. And again, these are questionable. Then Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, Philippians, 1 Timothy, Titus, 2 Timothy. What I want you to know for sure is the letters he wrote from prison when he was tied up, which would be Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians. Why Philippians is an amazing one? Remember what I said about the character of this? Joyful letter. Can you imagine? That's a character of St. Paul. He's always joyful whenever he is persecuted. You put him in prison, he's singing. As if he gets his joy from being persecuted for Christ. That's why he is joyful. So these are called the imprisonment letter or the captive letters, where he wrote them from captivity. These four. I always thought 2 Timothy is one, but apparently in the writing it is the second imprisonment. So you can add these 5 together, but at least those 4 in the first time. Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. And the most dear of them is Philippians. They're all written in the same time, but they all have a characteristic. They're actually not very angry or upset letters. There is nothing that he's angry with. And then 2 Timothy is also part of that. But you notice that all his instructive and dealing with problems is in his free missionary trips. Let's go into Philippians and then we'll end with that. Read it together. There is no doubt this is the most joyful writing, not only of St. Paul, but even in the New Testament, for different reasons. Philippians is the epistle of joy and encouragement in the midst of adverse circumstances. As I said, you put this and plot it against his life, and it doesn't really match at all. Paul freely expressed his fond affection for the Philippian Christians, appreciates their consistent testimony and support, and lovingly urges them to center their actions and thoughts on the pursuit of the person and power of Christ. He's given to you and me in this letter the key to be happy in adversity. And the key is finding Christ. There are 4 chapters in this letter. We're going to go through them in the coming 2 or 3 times. And it's really, this is one of the letters I kind of find worth studying in detail because it gives you the focus. In a nutshell, what do you need to do with the gospel as a Christian? What should I do? And the answer in this letter actually, how to find Christ every day. How to find him every day. That's the key. The themes. The date of writing. The traditional view has been that St. Paul wrote Philippians between AD 61 and 63. We said in his first Roman imprisonment. That's a late letter. He didn't do it when he was first converted or after he had started his missionary trips. It's in his imprisonment. Philippians is one of the 4. Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians. The reference to the palace, it's not the palace, place. It's the palace guard. There's a reference in the letter. We're going to look at it when we come into the details of the letter. It's in chapter 1, verse 13. There's a palace guard. It means that he was guarded. There was palace guard with him. And Caesar household in 422 fit with Paul's Roman imprisonment. In addition, St. Paul's statement in chapter 1, 12 to 20 and 422 strongly suggest that the imprisonment was fairly long. Thus, this letter appears to have been written some time after the beginning of Paul's imprisonment recorded in Acts 28. It immediately written after that chapter, the timeline of that chapter in Acts. Themes. Philippians is one of St. Paul's most personal letters. He speaks about himself in the most personal way, and it's very close to him. Another thing I want to tell you about this letter too, you come very close to St. Paul. This is very important, that the saints, when you come closer to a saint, you're coming closer to Christ, because they have the same mind. He says, imitate me as I'm imitating Christ. You come closer to him, you're actually meeting Christ through that very close disciple of his. That's why people used to love to congregate, to get gathered around people who had close relationship with our Lord. So it's one of the most personal letters. It shares his own experience with Christ and his struggle over whether to prefer dying to be with Christ or living to serve the Philippians. This is what you have. I have this struggle. I wish to die. To me, it's better to go to be with Christ. But I thought about it. Maybe it's expedient that I stay with you because you need me. The Philippians were in his heart, and they supported him in his imprisonment in chapter 1, verse 7. A fact which explains the note of gratitude that St. Paul frequently sounds in many verses. They helped him a lot in Philippians. And that's why when we come next time, I'm going to read with you his first experience in Philippi. You know, that he had this prison experience in Philippi. We're going to read this from the book of Acts next time. Philippians focuses on St. Paul's account of his prison circumstances, St. Paul's appeal to have the mind of Christ, his appeal to have the knowledge of Christ, and his appeal to have the peace of Christ. These are 3 chapters. So the first chapter is his circumstances, what's going on with him, and that's our beginning of the study. What's going on with me? What's happening in my life today? That's what he's writing to them from Rome. Second, he is encouraging them and pushing them and actually begging them to have the mind of Christ. And just to give you a note ahead, what is the mind of Christ that he wants to talk about? One word: humility. The mind of Christ is summarized in this word: humility, to be humble. And the second one in the second chapter is the knowledge of Christ. And that knowledge is not mind knowledge. We're not going to memorize things about Christ. We're not going to sit and write a thesis about him. The knowledge here is the gnosis, the experience. You read in the book of Genesis, and Adam knew his wife. Well, he didn't know her before. He knew her name. He's the one who named her, right? What is that about? He had a very intimate experience of that person. So this is what we talk about. The knowledge of Christ here is an experience of Christ that we have to have every day. And he has the appeal to have the peace of Christ, and the peace that is bringing on joy, which is a peace that surpasses all knowledge. Prominent in Philippians in the name in the theme of joy. The word joy, which is Greek for chara, joy, chara, is found 5 times, and the verb to rejoice occurs 11 times. You will not find that word repeated that many times in any other place in the New Testament. And once in these verses 2:28, 3:1, and 4:10, despite his unpleasant circumstances in prison, St. Paul manifests a joyous confidence in God's provision for him personally and for the Philippian Christians. St. Paul exhorts the Philippians to have a spirit of unity. That's another one. He actually talks about the joy and unity and mutual concern by embracing the attitude of humility. Unity is built on humility, not on any kind of policy. You know, people try to make unity through organizing things and making rules for everybody. You hear about the trend of independence, then interdependence. That creates unity. You hear that? These terms? Like when we were children, we were dependent on our parents. That created unity. I need my parents, and my parents need me. So we are one because of the need. Then I don't need my parents at teenage. I am independent. Now we don't have the unity. It's gone. But then you go back into interdependence in marriage. I need my wife, but also she needs me. And that creates that. But the unity that he's talking about is none of the above. It is something that comes from humility, by putting ourselves as servants for other, because our unity comes from the image and the example of Christ, that he given us the spirit of humility. He says, learn from me, from my meek and humble at heart. The attitude of humility, the greatest example of which is the incarnation and crucifixion of Christ. And there's a key word there that actually we're going to stop and examine for some time. It's called the Kenosis. That's Greek word. And it's the most difficult, one of the most difficult terms in theology of the New Testament. And we're going to spend some time with it. To empty oneself. Kenosis. Kenosis. These good Greek words to keep in mind as you study and look them up and to understand different meanings of them. Kenosis, or self-emptying of Christ, which does not mean that he relinquished his essential divinity, but he withheld his pre-incarnate glory and voluntarily restricted his use of certain attributes. To empty oneself, we'll speak about it in details, but it doesn't mean that he has given up being a God. That's not true. But he had abandoned the manifestation of his divinity. It's almost like I have a rich person who has $3 trillion, but then he goes to eat in McDonald's with his friends, and he would accept to share the expense. It doesn't mean that he's not rich, but he had relinquished, give up the prestige, and he accepted to be in the standard of his friends, which to him is a big loss, but it's a great gain for his friends. Now, the end line is in page 5. So chapter 1, simply, St. Paul, present circumstance, affliction for Christ. Chapter 2, have the mind of Christ, and which is humility. Chapter 3 is the knowledge of Christ against living for the flesh. And chapter 4, the peace of Christ, which is with God and with each other.